study. In these days, we go to the Word of God to seek a sense of meaning and purpose for what we face and for how we live in the world. So I welcome all of you who are joining us today for our study session. You can certainly share the feed with those in Facebook world. Host a watch party. Invite your neighbors and your friends to join us for a time of study and sharing together. So what we on Sunday, this past Sunday, Resurrection Sunday, the text for the sermon came from the book of Leviticus chapter 25 and offered us a real chance to think about the rhythm of resetting that God designs and purpose for life. And because, sermons are a 30-minute kind of snapshot of a text, there's not always the ample opportunity to delve deeply into particular details and to really open them up for extrapolation and for their enlightenment and their benefit. And so my hope is that today we would begin a little conversation around all things rest. All things rest. Really to talk about the principle of Sabbath, of sabbatical year, and the year of Jubilee. So I want to tell you what this is not. This is not this kind of doctrinal polemic or some way of browbeating people from other denominational identities, those who hold the Sabbath as a particular day. It's a way of helping us appreciate the gift that God gives to us to be able to enjoy God's creation, including the human family. And so as we go to the book today, I want to invite you in a moment of centering prayer. So God, open now the bread of life, break it unto us, and make real and make relevant what you have put in the sacred text, so that our witness might be ever more faithful, and that we might enjoy everything that you have intended and designed for us to enjoy. Bless all those who share together in this hour of study. Make it fruitful and productive, and make it meaningful for their lives. Through Jesus Christ, the Lord, we pray. Amen. All right. So I want us to center on our screen, and so if the camera shot can take up the screen, we can begin to walk through the passage. So this week I want us to take up the thought about the Sabbath. The Sabbath. This Hebrew word that we get its meaning as to stop or to cease has come to be known as the day of rest, a day of rest. It's an important concept and an important function, not just for the people of ancient Israel, but for those who have observed Sabbath rest throughout the centuries, and even today still engage in the practice of Sabbath rest. We get the Sabbath rest as a commemoration, first, of God's rest after the work of creation is completed. And there are two references that are important for this. One comes from Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, thereabout. The other comes from Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, and we'll read Exodus 20, 11 to about maybe 13, 14, 15, thereabout, so that we can appreciate what it means in its context. So it commemorates God's rest after completing the work of creation. And secondly, it is a commemoration of God's mighty hand of deliverance upon Egypt, upon the children of Israel as they were in Egypt. So it's two things, twofold: God's rest after creation is completed, and then God's deliverance of the children of Israel from Egypt, from bondage, from oppression, that we get in the story of the Exodus. And it has come to be associated with the seventh day. Now this particular point, I think becomes a center of some tension among Christian denominations about which day is the Sabbath and how do you count the Sabbath. But what we must appreciate is that the development of the concept of the Sabbath in the Old Testament record gets us to a principle, right? A set of time that we set apart and consecrate as holy for the purposes of God. And of course, you're perhaps asking the question, okay, what does this mean in light of what's going on? I want you to hold that question in mind. Keep that question in tension, because it's a good question to ask and to consider, especially for what we must contend to, okay? So then let's take up the passage in Exodus chapter 20. If you go to your Bibles, Exodus chapter 20. I want to read verses 8, 9, 10, and 11 from the particular passage in the New Revised Standard Version of the text. And it reads in this wise: "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or your female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it." So the context of Exodus 20 is the covenant that is being established with Israel, this newly delivered people, perhaps now maybe about 11, 12 months out of bondage. And within that year, God is going to seal the deal for them and declaring for them that they would be a kingdom of priests, that they would share in a special relationship with God, in covenant with God. And as a result of this covenant with God, God is kind of establishing their identity as a people. And in the establishment of their identity as a people is setting forth for them things that would govern their way of life. Not only their devotion to God, but also their relationship within community. And so this is what we call the Decalogue, the Big Ten, the Ten Commandments. And And as children, we learned them, and it was recited to us, and we had to, recite them back. And it's kind of fallen out of people's consciousness, perhaps, because we consider, okay, it's law, it's Old Testament, but it's really a way of setting the parameters of living in community with one another. It's really God's way of instituting for them social order, the ways that they should practice their faith, and what is decent, what's acceptable, what should be publicly commendable to those who are engaged. And so as this particular commandment, the fourth commandment in the order is enumerated, it begins in verse 8 with the verb remember. Remember. And if you underline that, it's a different rendering when you get to the book of Deuteronomy around chapter 5, somewhere around verse 15 there about. The notion is around observing, but in this passage it's remembering the Sabbath and keeping it holy. So underline and keep it holy. Keep it holy. All right. So holiness, holy in this context is about setting it apart. Okay, it's no magic. It's no great mystery. It's about setting it apart. And that's really what it is to be holy, right? To be set apart for the use of God, for God's purposes. That's what it means to be holy. Now, within the Christian tradition, denominations have popped up, and you've got a strand called the Holiness Church, and they've got a set of disciplines and protocols that are observed, and people think that to be holy, at least when I was coming up younger in the church, to be holy means no makeup. You can't wear any makeup. No, you can't wear any jewelry. No, the only thing you could wear was a watch, and you had to be careful that watch wasn't, just beautifully adorned. You had to just put Vaseline on your lips and go about your business. You couldn't, women ain't gonna wear no pants, and got to wear your long skirts. And even the sisters, when they wore denim skirts, it wasn't denim pants, it was denim skirts, and that was their sense. Head covered, that was their sense. Now, there's a sense of modesty in that, and I don't want to even knock the sense of people's personal holiness, what someone would regard as being the standard by which he or she wants to live in a way that offers him or herself to God, pleasing as that offering. That's, it's good. But for this particular passage in this context, to be holy, to keep it holy, is simply to set it apart. This belongs to God. And it makes sense because the next verse says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. So he's really setting and instituting what should be the rhythm of working in community, of trading, of commerce, of industry, of vocation, of your professional life. He says you got 6 days to labor and do all your work. But then, on this seventh day, give it as a rest to the Lord. Give it as a rest to the Lord. Give it as a rest to the Lord. And in this particular passage, they are called to recollect. They're called to pause, and time is being structured, and time is being consecrated and made holy in its relationship to God, in its relationship to you giving it to God, the time is being set aside and being consecrated for the Lord's use. So the Lord then commands that the seventh day or the Sabbath, you ought to set it aside. But also in this particular passage, it is a call to think about what God has done. So it says, verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. God becomes the model. What God has done in Genesis chapter 2, which we will come to in a few minutes, becomes the model for Israel, which is to say, if God thought it fitting as a way of ceasing after the work of creation is complete, then how much should we take it as a significant thing to do to honor not only the God of creation, but also to honor the God of their deliverance. This is post-Egypt. And as a result of it, they are being called into this relationship with him that would order their lives, and even their days need to reflect it. And it's really a point for all of us to consider that our relationship with God then permeates every aspect of our lives. That there is no aspect of your life that is either off limits to God, or that you can say, hey, God has nothing to do with that. No. Every part of it. And Sabbath really calls us into a wholeness of being. A wholeness of being, so that even work and rest, labor and play are a part of who we are, and reflecting even the genius of God in whose image we are created. So he gives us this call to remember in Exodus chapter 20, this fourth commandment. I want us then now to go to Deuteronomy chapter 5, the book of Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 12, verse 13 and 14 and 15, if we consider in the passage. So it reads in this wise: observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male or female slave or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the resident alien in your towns, so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So in this passage, in juxtaposition to Exodus chapter 20, we get Deuteronomy, the restatement of the law, or the reminder of the law, as the children of Israel are on the precipice of their entry and their taking the promised land. And as a result of their nearness to seizing and laying claim to the promise, there's a necessary reminder from their iconic leader that when you get into the land, don't forget to remember certain things. And one of the things that they are called to be reminded of it is the Big Ten, the Decalogue, the commands of God that lay forth social order with God. They're called to remember it. And he says you ought to observe it, keep it holy. Similar language. Exodus 20 would say remember. Deuteronomy 5 says observe. But they're both calling for it to be consecrated as it is by God, kept holy, and labor in 6 days, but give the seventh day to God. Now, in Deuteronomy 5, we get more parts added in it, not just your son and your daughter, not just your male and female slave, though we get son and daughter in Exodus 20. We also now get your ox or your donkey, as we have livestock in Exodus 20, or the resident aliens in your town, which is to say, even if there are guests in your city, they too are called to honor what it is you honor. And this is a point I think worth emphasizing, is that when we live out of this special relationship and covenant with God, when we live with a sense of duty and a response to what God has set up for us, then even that will make a claim on the people who are around us, right? That it ought to be in such an influential way, lead them to a similar and same observance, so that even they will acknowledge ultimately it's God who becomes the source, not us. And this was important to proclaim on Sunday and to remind you of it today, because it cannot be stressed enough. It is God who is the source of the supply, not we ourselves. But here in this particular passage, the reflection is stressed to the observance. Keep it. And the time of Sabbath becomes a time of worship, to remember God as creator, right? Remember God as creator, because you see here, where is it? In Exodus chapter 20, in Exodus chapter 20, you have verse 11 saying, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Then you have here verse 15 of Deuteronomy 5. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and your Lord brought you up out of there, and with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So in Exodus 20, you get this rest as a response to God's model in creation. And in Deuteronomy 5, particularly verse 15, you get rest as a response to what God has done on behalf of Israel in bringing them up out of Egypt with a mighty hand. So this time of worship is a remembrance of God as creator, and a remembrance of God as deliverer. Now look, I'm telling you, ain't nobody else in America can really shout like black folks can, but we do it because we have history of what? Deliverance. History of deliverance. Now you can think about it, because it's like what we do in the month of February. It's not that we don't do it all year long, but we set that aside as a way of saying we are going to reflect on our deliverance. We're going to remember. We're going to observe. We're going to recollect. We're going to pause long enough to be reminded of where we were and where we are now. And when you think about where we are now in light of where we were, then it is a cause for, yes, worship. It is a cause for thanksgiving, and the homage and the real praise and the worship is all directed to God, because God is the one whose mighty hand has worked what it is we have. Also, I want us to think about Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2. Rest after creation. So in Genesis 2, 1, 2, and 3, we get the record. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. Now, if you read it anthropomorphically, it may suggest to you that God was tired. No, God is never weary. God is never fatigued, right? God don't need holiday or sick leave. This word in the Hebrew, rested, it means to cease, to stop. And really, what do you do when you're finished creating? You stop. He stops, because the work of creation, as the priestly writers give to us, in evening and morning first day, evening and morning second day, evening and morning third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, then comes the completion of what God's creative activity has brought forth. And God says, hey, it's good. It's good. And so God sets aside this seventh day and hallows it. Now you can go down a rabbit hole trying to mark time in such a stringent form. You can get down a rabbit hole. And I was about to go down a rabbit hole this morning, and I decided, it is not even worth it, because you can count. Okay, which day do you count as the first day? Is it Sunday? Okay, what part of Sunday? Is it Sunday during the daylight, or Sunday during the evening time? Because if you take the record of the priests, it says it's evening and morning. Now, this is a really material for a good sermon. It's about God's days beginning at night, God's days beginning in darkness, right? And God bringing light as the response to darkness. That's the consummate response to darkness, light. God illuminating, God enlightening, God revealing, God showing forth, so that you and I don't have to contend with darkness as being our only reality. It's God's response to darkness. And in light of that, then you think about how from the evening to the morning, how God's rhythm is making clear what happens. I mean, that's why the psalmist says, weeping endures for the night. That's what nighttime represents, but joy comes in. The last word of God will never be darkness. It will always be light. So God rests, and then God, in verse 3 of Genesis chapter 2, God blesses the seventh day and hallows it, makes it holy, because only God rested from all the work that he had done in creation, which is to say that after every 6 days of labor, you got to rest. After every 6 days of labor. Now, if you would remember last July in our summer revival, one of the sermons that Pastor Pointer preached talked about the rest as they were transporting the ark of God back to the place of God. And as the priests were moving forward, they took their 6 steps and then they paused, they rested. Because even in the activity of that labor, they were modeling before God that 6 days belong to you. These 6 things are yours, and the 7th is his. 7 being that number of completion, that divine number, meaning it's all accomplished. That 7th thing is given to him for God's use and God's glory. So we get in this account the establishment of the 7th day as being sacred, and God models it by God's own behavior. Now, for the teachers out there, you know that in your years of instruction, you had to do what you call modeling. You had to model for your students what you wanted them to do. So you would write on the board, whatever it is, and you would solve it because you are showing them what it is that they ought to do, what you expect of them. And God is the consummate teacher, that God opens by showing us this is what you ought to do. 6, yours. 7, mine. 6, yours. 7, mine. So, if you take Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5, Genesis 2, and you try to offer this reflection, you think about this theologically, about what it means for us. There are 4 things at least I want to lift up for us that the Sabbath offers us opportunities to do that come from the passages. 1, it offers us an opportunity for reflection. A reflection on God's handiwork in creation. For the passages talk about the 6 days that God spent creating, God calling forth, God speaking, God's active voice in creation, making real and tangible God's intentions for life. And the rest of the Sabbath gives us an opportunity to reflect on what God has done. Now, that's in contrast. There's a story in the New Testament about a man, who had amassed a lot of wealth, and he was just accumulating stuff. He had a barn of stuff, and hey, he would look periodically at the barn and think about, hey, look, I got a whole lot of stuff. And then when I ask, well, what are you going to do with all this stuff? Well, I'm going to hold on to it. But because I'm running out of space, I'm just going to build a bigger barn. And I'm just going to put that stuff in there. And I'm going to try to continue to accumulate as much more stuff as I can. Right? That's his reflection on his work, on his achievement of what he has been able to attain. It's not a reflection on God's ability working through him, or even an acknowledgement of God himself. It's human-centered. But the Sabbath is a way of reflecting on what God has done. How God has created not just you and I, yes, even us, fearfully, wonderfully, gifted, just talented, skillful, creative, brilliant, beautiful, lovely, sweet, all of that about us, but also the creation. and as a way of reflecting on what God is doing. It's also an opportunity, secondly, for reverence. Because God blessed the day. God set it aside as holy. Now, don't, I'm glad you're not in the sanctuary, so you can't throw anything at me. But there used to be a time when, in growing up, parents didn't let you do a whole lot of stuff on the Lord's Day as a way of instilling in you that this day was a special kind of day. And I get it. We are so maxed out in all of our social engagements, and we give our calendars to everyone and everything. We do. But when we do it, bit by bit, we start edging God out, bit by bit. And I know it's not your intent. It's not your plan. You didn't sit down and design it this way so that you have less time for God. You didn't do it. But think about how subtle the temptations are that encroach on the time that you used to hallow for the worship of God. Yeah, that you used to say that this belongs to God in light of it. Because remember remember Deuteronomy 5, right? Deuteronomy 5 says, you're doing it because you remember what God has done for you. What has he done? He's brought you up out of the house of Egypt. God, with God's mighty hand, God made it possible. And don't become so ingrained and so open to everything to the point that you think, yeah, it's okay. I'm gonna just sleep in on this day, and I'm just gonna, it's a day of rest, and I work hard, 5-6 days, and it's the only time I have, to get up early in the morning and go golfing. It's the only time I have to wash my car. It's the only time I have to go to brunch, right? You could brunch after 8 o'clock service, right? Yes, yeah. Right? It says, because there's a whole generation of folks now for whom Sunday is just that meeting up day. It's just a day of we're just going to have some fun. And of course, you need to have fun and have recreation and rejuvenation and refreshment and all of that. But in all of it, do not edge out the one who gave you the day as the gift. Don't edge God out. Don't make God the optional part of your Sabbath experience. Then it's an opportunity to remember, as we just said, God's mighty hand of deliverance. And I really invite you to even put right now in the comments section, or to write down on a piece of paper, what are your remembrances of deliverance? And what comes to mind when you think about what has taken place on your behalf? Yes, we have collective experiences of deliverance, but then we have particular experiences and stories of deliverance that we need to be reminded of. That if other people forget, we will always hold dear to our hearts what has taken place on our behalf. Right. So he gives us as an opportunity to remember. But then it's also an opportunity here to to rest. And that's important, to rest, to rest. Now, I want to talk for about a minute or so to you workaholics. Yes. Go on and raise your hand right now, because we can't even see it. Right. You workaholics who think that you have to do it every day. And if you don't do it, it won't get done. Right? Right? You who believe that if you don't show up there, it just, listen, don't even do that to yourself. Because the notion of working 7 days without rest is like saying, look, I'm really the one making it happen for myself alone. When God, who is omnipotent, who possesses power and then some, could model for us what it's like to pause and to man, I've done it, and just look at it. Then you too need that opportunity for rest. The Protestant work ethic is always about thinking that our doing is going to make all things happen. And there are some things that we cannot do for ourselves. There are some things we have to trust God for. We have to turn to God. We have to commit to God's keeping and God's care if we are going to survive. Sabbath gives us rest opportunity to reset and to be refreshed. Now, listen, I'm telling you, this is important now because everybody getting some rest at home. Hopefully, that's my prayer. That's really my prayer, that we're getting some rest. And I know you're looking at your husband and your wife every day, all day, or you're looking at your children every day, all day. You got to be parent and cook and teacher and superintendent and coach, everything now. I get it. But I was talking with a good covenant brother of mine back home in Nassau, and he was sharing with me his thoughts about the sermon that I preached on Sunday morning, and he was thinking about how much opportunity that he has now to rest. This is my brother Chris, who lived in Abaco and who was displaced from Abaco to New Providence after Hurricane Dorian, and he's had these about 6 months now, he says, of rest that he hasn't had in his entire adult life. He says he's sitting on the back patio and he's enjoying some of the labor, the fruits of his labor. He says when he was working constantly, incessantly, he never had the time to go back on the patio, sit back, and just look around and observe all that he worked so hard to get. And some of us, we're always driven by the next thing, what's ahead, that you don't take the time long enough to say, you know what, God's been good, yeah, and to appreciate what that means. It happens even so much among clergy who believe that we got to constantly be the one that, no, we are not the great shepherd. We are the under shepherd. We serve under the great shepherd, which means it's God's power will raise their issues. Is which day of the week is it that you ought to use as the Sabbath? Now, in the record of the New Testament, we do have Jewish Christians who kept Sabbath in synagogal communities, right? They went to the synagogue, and others, who who had converted to the faith as a result of hearing the gospel proclaimed in synagogal communities and gave themselves to the movement as they were first called, the followers of the way, right? This Jesus movement that sprang up and that just took root and captivated people's imagination and arrested their attention. And only at Antioch, when they were called Christian, and they were called Christian as a kind of derisive and a pejorative term, oh, those Christians over there. Yeah, they named it, but they had an experiences in the synagogue and in the tradition. But then quickly, Sunday or the Lord's Day became the day on which the followers of the way, the people who were a part of the Jesus movement, would come to celebrate the resurrection. Right? It became important. And this is why Sunday is so important in the Christian faith, because it is the day of the resurrection. And ultimately, what we are exclaiming is the Lord's resurrection. Now, I know we got a lot of Calvary songs, and you ought to have them. But your number of Calvary songs should not outnumber your amount of resurrection songs. Because if it just stopped at Calvary, you're bloody. You're only bloody. But God vindicated the sacrifice, because there were some other folks who died that day. But the difference between the man in the middle and the one on the left and the one on the right is that early Sunday morning, God did something for the man in the middle he didn't do for the one on the left or the right. He raised him from the dead. So resurrection becomes our identity. Now, really, this is an opportunity to really think about this, because the baptismal identity we have in Christ is a resurrection identity. This is what Paul is arguing in Romans, being buried in a death like his, being raised unto a resurrection like his. It's a resurrection identity. And listen, for the Christian funeral in particular, the liturgy of the Christian funeral is a resurrection liturgy. All right? Now, this is really for another series of teaching that hopefully we'll get to. But let me just give you a good 60 seconds of it, because in the early church, when they had the death of a brother or sister, they went to worship with the remains of that brother or sister, to take that brother or sister to the place of their rest as a way of signifying they were returning that person to God, who gave that person to them as a part of the community. So it became the resurrection liturgy that was prominent. And so it ought to be among us, that when you come up in a church with somebody who lived and died in the faith, man, we ain't singing, I'm missing you. Yeah, though that's a part of it, we're singing the songs of resurrection, because that's what they believed. We're not trying to make it a therapy session, though you need to have pastoral care, but that can happen after. In the service, we are celebrating this sister or brother lived in the Lord, died in the Lord, and so this brother, sister is the Lord's. That's what we're celebrating. So resurrection becomes important for the early Christians. Now, take the record of Justin Martyr, who was a Greek philosopher and an early Christian apologist. He was arguing, this is how he was saying. He was saying that the 8th day, talking about Sunday, right? Because if you count from Sunday to Sunday, it's 8 days, right? That the 8th day, or the first day of the week, and you would have reference to this when Paul would talk about giving, on the first day of the week, let you lay aside what you're about to give. He says it's the day when God created the world, which made Sunday a feast of the new creation. Oh, praise his name. That's the way every Sunday is. It's the feast of the new creation. That's why even in the season of Lent, that the Sundays of Lent are not Sundays of Lent, but in Lent, because they show for us that they are many Easters, many Resurrection Sundays, because they are a part of the feast of the new creation. God, who having made all things new, is giving us an opportunity to bask and to celebrate in it. It was also important as the early church did its work. There's in Acts chapter 2, I think around verse 42, they said, and they devoted themselves in the apostles' teaching, or the apostles' doctrine. That word there, teaching or doctrine, from the New Testament Greek is didache, right? And the didache was the oldest community rule of the ancient church. It was what their protocol and a codified way of putting their teaching together. And for them, they gave instructions on celebrating the Lord's Day. Right? So this is what they said in this instruction. You ought to come together. You ought to break bread. Hold the Eucharist after confessing your transgressions, that your offering may be pure. Now, already you're hearing the teachings of the Apostle Paul. You're hearing that. Now, this would have been before he would give us that in Corinthians, because he says, I'm going to give to you what was passed on to me. Right? So the confessing of transgressions would precede the breaking of bread, the holding of the Eucharist. And notice how they wanted to safeguard the integrity and the unity of the expression of communion and fellowship. But let none who has a quarrel with his fellow join you in your meeting until they be reconciled, that your sacrifice may not be defiled. In other words, keep that cantankerous one out until they are ready to deal with their cantankerous character and become a part of the fellowship again. Right, keep them out. So even in there, you would hear echoes in the record of the Gospels, the admonition, hey, if you're going to come and offer your sacrifice, and you remember, look, somebody's got something against, look, leave your sacrifice there, your offering there, go, be reconciled with the one, and then come again, right? Because for them, the imperative was you have to maintain your relationship, not just with God, but with each other. You got to keep it right. All right. So finally, as I've come to the end of the hour, before I get to that final slide, because I'm a Baptist preacher, I got to give you something before I really shut it down. Sabbath controversy in Mark chapter 2. You recall on one Sabbath day, as he was going through the grain fields, as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? There are always some watchers. Always somebody who is looking at you to see and ensure you're doing it the way it's supposed to be done. And he said to them, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. As they are trying to push him on what's appropriate in ritual practice, he's trying to help them understand that all of our rituals ought to really be subordinate to the needs of people. All of our rituals ought to be subordinate to the needs of people, that the needs of people ought to figure more prominently than just the practice of your rituals. And because Jesus is master of the Sabbath, because he is active in creation, because he's a participant in the rest of God on the Sabbath, because he has helped to consecrate it and make it holy, he can say to them, look, it's made for us to be refreshed and to be restored, not to make the Sabbath and the keeping of the Sabbath so stringent that it becomes nothing other than 7-day work. It becomes nothing other than I have to police you and police myself, and thereby not enjoying the rest that the day affords me. My hope is that in these days you are getting an opportunity to rest, and you ought to really take it. You know, right now there's some things you just can't do, and because you can't do it, accept it. Take a rest. Pause and observe a stillness of the moment that reminds you of your trust and your hope in God, that you still need God. And my hope for you is that you would be refreshed in it, and that you would find all that you need to honor your relationship with him who has made you who you are. So may God be merciful and favorable and gracious toward you in these days and your families. May God continue to sustain you, to give you the kind of peace and the comfort that you need. May God watch over all the member families of our church who are experiencing death and loss, so that they might be sustained. The blessings of God be upon you, each and every one of you, during these days. And I look forward to you sharing with us in worship on Sunday morning. Amen.